You gonna say something?
And you're live. Can you hear me okay, Anita?
Yes, I can. So Kelly, on the Facebook, it's just your face they see, right?
We'll see whoever's speaking. All right, we're ready to begin. Anita, can you hear me?
Yes, okay. Welcome. This afternoon, it is More Than Lupus honor and desire to educate ourselves and empower ourselves. And we're extremely delighted that Dr. Brian Gibbs has humbly agreed to lead us in our second authentic conversation about race, racial equality, and the history of race relations in this country. Here today is myself, Anita Love, a board member of More Than Lupus and a 20-year lupus warrior. I'm honored to serve as your moderator. Kelly Rosetta, founder and creator of More Than Lupus, and a 28-year lupus warrior, is also here. And as most of you know her as our lupus advocate, facilitator, and of our Facebook chats, and award-winning blogger. We thank you for taking the time out of your busy lives to join us. At this time, I would like us to take a few seconds and just pause on the words you're going to hear next. At this time, I would ask that each of you would quiet yourselves, remove the busyness of this day from your mind, and be willing to open your hearts, souls, and minds for the next 60 minutes. Thank you. I mentioned we have Dr. Brian Gibbs, who has willingly agreed to work with us a second time to help us to gain a honest and authentic look and peel back some of the complexities of race. Dr. Gibbs has a very long and distinctive career, from being Associate Dean for Diversity and Cultural Competence at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, to most recently serving as Vice President for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at Portland, Oregon's own Oregon Health Sciences University. Again, thank you, Dr. Gibbs, for taking the time. A few ground rules. I would like to now give some information. For the next hour, it is intended to be a safe environment where all questions, comments, views are to be respected. You may see or hear something that makes you feel uncomfortable. We ask that you don't shy away from it, but be willing to lean into that feeling. You're among fellow human beings who, like you, want to grow and be challenged. We pledge to be honest and authentic, and we kindly ask that you be willing to do the same. Respect is the core rule here. We also ask that if you see a slide, have a question about something, that you jot that question down. And once Dr. Gibbs has concluded his remarks, we will then answer your questions. We understand and hope that you do as well, that we may not get to all of your questions. All the more reason to have a further discussion, February 2021. Now, without further talking from me, I would like each of us in our own way to welcome Dr. Brian Gibbs. We are now in the capable hands of Dr. Gibbs. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for the opportunity to work with you again and the More Than Lupus organization. Kelly, thank you so much for extending the invitation and providing me with yet another opportunity to feel challenged and to feel courage and to again acknowledge my commitment to serving communities in however community may approach me as a servant. In the next 20 minutes, my hope is to connect us and hold us and elevate us through inspiration and dimensions of hope. It won't be easy, but it's absolutely necessary to change our views by changing our vantage points. And so collectively we can do it together, but most importantly is how we commit to sustaining the momentum, the inspiration, the sense of hope that we will bask ourselves in over the next hour. My presentation outline will include just setting the stage, a brief overview of health disparities and historical accounts of race and racism in the United States, lessons learned, and building community resources. As we all know, America is in the midst of reckoning with the legacies of racism, racial violence, and systematic injustice against Black people. The current national uprising sparked by the recent murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery have exposed the complex intersections of history, politics, and the law, and how race, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness function in American society. I am honored to join you for this conversation about these issues, and again, how we can chart a new future for Black lives and for all lives. What are health disparities? Disparities are the differentials in health and healthcare between groups that are closely linked to social, economic, or environmental disadvantages. Disparities occur on many dimensions, including race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, where you live, who you live alongside, how long you've been living, your gender, disability status, gender identity, and sexual orientation. We know that disparities in outcomes occur because of the health conditions, be it cancer, diabetes, heart disease, kidney, HIV, AIDS, mental health, respiratory diseases. It impacts across populations, whether you're young, old, urban, rural, men, women, immigrants, non-immigrants, racial or ethnic groups, poor or disabled, or identified with the LGBTQIA community. It can occur in the settings where one is anticipating optimal care, whether that be in primary care, emergency care, hospital care, specialty care, or nursing homes. The levels and types of care, whether it's preventative or chronic disease management, or getting medical tests or procedures. Disparities can occur by the ways in which healthcare workers perceive and or systems mitigate against one receiving optimal care. The contributing factors when we think about the disparity group, no matter what group it might be, there are biological factors that can have impact on what one has been exposed to and how stress, as an example, can have an impact. What cultural factors, norms, or beliefs one may have or any group may have in its relationship to the healthcare system. Socioeconomic barriers, environmental barriers, the psychosocial factors that influence whether you feel like going to the doctor to hear the same old, or are pressed into going at the last minute because you've come to a point where you feel so bad that you just have to go, or you don't want to feel worse after you come away. It also, disparities create the complexities when it comes to what type of access to healthcare you might have based upon your ability to pay or inability to pay, and the degree to which that ability to pay may have an impact on the quality of healthcare you receive. This is not a new phenomena. There's a legacy throughout the United States, our history, where certain groups of people have experienced poor health conditions, discrimination, and unknowingly have suffered abuse as participants in research. Whether it be the Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, Japanese Americans, poor, unemployed, or homeless, there are compromises that the healthcare system will make based upon that particular demographic profile, and it has existed historically. For instance, in the 17th through early 20th centuries, or 1601 through 1940s, white physicians studied as researchers Black slaves and their descendants to identify characteristics that were distinctive of their race. These so-called researchers that would otherwise become known as pseudoscientists believed that if Blacks had poor health outcomes in comparison to whites, that those differences were due to some inherent racial weakness or biological flaw or genetic predisposition, and were not in any way related to economic or social circumstances. Research played a role in constructing a narrative of race in the United States, the repercussions of which are still being felt in the lives of African Americans today. We don't have to go very far in our research to know that there was a belief around the great chain of being that, as you can see at the lower part of the photo, the image of a white man on the top of the great chain of being, that individual or that race, although race was a social construct, not one based upon the evidence of science to suggest who was superior and who was inferior. And the second individual from the top would be an African man, and then the image of a chimpanzee. Those were the beliefs of pseudoscientists, and those racist supremacy perspectives pervade our mindsets today. There were those who participated in medically prescribed punishment, such as Samuel Cartwright in 1793 through 1863. He, as a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine and a professor at the University of Louisiana, theorized that Blacks should medically be treated differently due to their non-human biological peculiarities. Cartwright authored Mental Diseases for Blacks and published a review in New Orleans titled Diseases and Peculiarities of the Negro Race. He had things like runaway madness, termed as drapetomania, a disease that caused Blacks to run away from slavery. Uppity rebelliousness or rascalinity he prescribed as dysphagia aethiopica. He prescribed the treatment for slaves like children if they were rebellious, and that they should be punished with whippings as preventative measures to beat the devil out of them and prevent them from absconding or running away. The sheer nature of a human being forced with pain and enslavement, would be so inclined, healthy, and resilient to find the resolve to escape the oppressor was perceived as peculiar behavior. Dr. J. Marion Sims has been called the father of gynecology, and he is credited with originating the first successful treatment for vagina fistula, a severe condition caused by prolonged labor that results in urinary incontinence and was common in the mid-1800s. He performed hundreds of surgeries on Black slave women without anesthesia in a backyard hospital where gynecology was born. While it's true that informed consent was not around during Dr. Marion Sims' surgeries, he continued to withhold anesthesia for his Black patients, holding the view fairly typical of his time that wealthy white women were far more susceptible to pain during surgery than working class white women or Black female slaves. Many of you know of the Tuskegee syphilis study, where between 1932 to 1927 in Macon County, Alabama, about 400 male African-American sharecroppers with syphilis were followed in an observational trial without their knowledge or consent. The men were offered special free medical care and were told that they were being treated for bad blood. Though penicillin was discovered as an effective treatment for syphilis 10 years into that study, these men were denied treatment for over 30 years. Researchers were interested in understanding the effects of untreated syphilis. This warranted a public outcry. And after the study was reported on the front page of the New York Times, the government appointed an advisory panel to review what had occurred. And the panel found that although the men had agreed to be examined and treated, they did not have proper consent. But I want to be clear that when there is conversation about the reticence on the part of African Americans in this country being less inclined or motivated to participate in clinical research, the distrust is not about Tuskegee. The distrust is the Africans' experience since being brought to, enslaved in, semi-freed, and freed with limited rights in an America that says all men are created equal. For example, I provide a brief historical summary of what it's like, and it's in the soliloquy of Breathing in America, where briefly I'll provide an oversight and then I'll read a more contemporary reflection of what I just said. Between 1619 to 1865, or 246 years, that represents 61% of the African Americans' experience since being brought to America. The status in that particular period of time of 61% of our existence in America was as chattel slavery. Disparate, unequal, poor health status, poor health outcomes, and poor health treatment. The treatment received was as chattel slavery, what you would provide a pig, a hog, a cow, to keep that animal in its proper position productivity, and purpose. And the slave health subsystem was in effect. 1865 to 1965, or 100 years, what is considered 25%, where Jim Crow was in effect, where slaves were freed but had virtually no citizenship rights, compromised housing, education, employment opportunities, inferior treatment, and inferior facilities to receive any level of education, employment, or healthcare. And in 1965 through 2019, where we are today, only 54 years or 14% of having rights, equal access, civil rights. And yet we still see gerrymandering in voting. We are the last hired and first fired. And we go on and on and on and on in terms of what has been an unfulfilled promise. And so for the 400 years since 1619 to 2019, or 100% of the US experience, the struggle continues. So here I reflect on those words with the Breathing in America reflection. For 400 years, African Americans have had difficulty breathing while living. When African Americans were captured, brought over to, and enslaved in America, they were in the bottom of slave ships and couldn't breathe. During 250 years of slavery, we couldn't breathe. We had difficulty breathing during and through 100 years of Jim Crow, and there was no access to adequate education, employment, healthcare, or housing. And since 1965, when the passage of the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act legislation came about, or another way of saying it, after 54 years of segregation, mass incarceration, and inequality in every social structure there is, we still can't breathe. As a worldwide pandemic, it is clear that COVID-19 does not discriminate, and yet in the United States, there is a profile that suggests the contrary. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, among those states that are collecting race data, Black people accounted for a higher share of confirmed cases in 20 of 31 states, and deaths in 19 of 24 states, compared to their share of the total population. Racial and health disparities occur on at least 3 different levels: differential access to healthcare, differential care within the healthcare system, and differences in exposure and life opportunities that create different levels of health and disease. But I would contend that there are structural challenges, policies and system level challenges that have historically pervaded upon and limited the experiences of African Americans living in an unwise, biased world. So we have a phenomena here of the policing in the African American community, which I'd like to just draw your attention to a poster that we found in a museum from 1851 that reads, "Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all. You are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers of Boston. For since the recent order of the mayor and aldermen, they are empowered to act as kidnappers and slave catchers. And they have already been employed in kidnapping, catching, and keeping slaves. Therefore, if you value your liberty and the welfare of the fugitives among you, Shun them in every possible manner, as so many hounds are on the track of the most unfortunate of your race. Keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers and have a top eye open. So if you just consider the stress and the dimensions that really capture the history, not the momentary flashpoints that we are now able to capture on our cell phones and post them on our websites. This is a history that is rarely told, spoken about, but definitely a history that's passed on in the African and African American community relative to keeping Black boys safe. So the evidence of that racism in medicine is there as well, but I want to make it clear that any level of profiling outside of healthcare impacts what happens inside of healthcare. We have had over 1,000 studies, and a few are listed here, that attest to the racial profiling that occurs in healthcare. The opportunity to foster diversity, equity, and inclusion allows an emergence of new researchers of color who will reflect on and lean into the space where others have been less inclined to look at data representing racial differences. And so when we do a closer look, we can see Hispanic patients were twice as likely as white patients to receive pain medication when presenting to the emergency room with a fresh bone fracture, or Black patients with broken arms and legs were less likely than white patients to receive painkillers when presenting to an Atlanta ER. In both instances, it is perceived that these are drug-seeking individuals, not those who are in distress. Briefly, because so many of you are living the experience of lupus and you understand the data and what the research shows, I provided to at least call out in the next slide differences that occur in a space where we're looking discretely at the lupus patient and yet seeing the complexity in terms of the outcome or impact of living with this disease has when you consider aspects of race and class. Over 1.5 million Americans and at least 5 million people worldwide live with some form of lupus. It strikes mostly women of childbearing age. Most people with lupus develop the disease between the ages of 15 through 44. There are devastating and life-changing diseases, especially for ethnic subpopulations in the United States. And currently there is no cure for lupus. We see that African American and people of color have 2 to 3 times more experience lupus among women of color in comparison to Caucasian women, whether they be African Americans, Hispanic, Latinos, Asians, Native American, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and other Pacific Islanders. There is a difference in the experience. It affects 1 in 537 young African American women. African American lupus patients are more likely to have organ system involvement, more active disease, and lower levels of social support compared with white lupus patients. Minority women tend to develop lupus at a younger age and experience more serious complications, and they have higher mortality rates. In 1999, our federal government, Congress requested that the Institute of Medicine, the physician's physician, study to look at unequal treatment in healthcare, to assess the degree to which racial and ethnic minorities and non-minorities differed in the types and quality of healthcare received. to explore factors that, if in fact these disparities occurred, what contributes to the disparities, and to recommend practices and policies. This panel of many others identified racial and ethnic disparities that exist in the healthcare system, that with comparable age, diagnosis, and risk factors, there was still yet a differential in the quality of care received or the medical treatment provided. Racial and ethnic disparities in health occur in the same context of our history and are very consistent with social and economic inequality. In other words, the policies and practices that impact people based on where they live, where they are able to live, with whom do they socialize, what type of education are their children receiving? That same bias, that same discrimination, that same segregation occurs and is a part of the psyche of any individual who works within the healthcare system. No one is free of it. And so the practices that need to happen impacts everyone, including the healthcare system, its many providers, patients, and all the different managers or touch points within that system. And it's an institutional and intellectual policy and a personal joint journey. When we know that we have to move outside of the box to create change, we can't anticipate change to occur when we are in the same box that we exist in. So thinking outside of the box means that people who develop systems and policies can't also be the people who really have the best thinking on what should happen. Involving communities and those who are most impacted is crucial. And similar to the civil rights movement, we need those movements to use indirect action, marches, teach-ins, workshops, civil disobedience at the community level, in recognizing the importance of cultural animation and train the community residents in effective cultural strategies. Black Lives Matter, hands up, don't shoot. Things that really resonate across the world, let alone in one's community. So some of the strategies we know are important, that activism is important. Longevity and holding one accountable to restoring faith and hope, not to take it away and selfishly absorb oneself, but to think about when you take your faith and you live in your hope, but you don't contribute to the faith and hopes of others, you are taking from them and they have less and you have more. And so we have to figure out a way in our professional and personal lives to stay involved and be clear about accountability and the necessity around longevity. We need to see the people we're working alongside as asset-based, not deficit-oriented. We need to build an infrastructure of community participation, career development, training for partners. We need to utilize the research process with a fair amount of transparency so that we have more accurate race and ethnicity data, and we can examine the role of racism in diminishing the health of an entire population. I leave you with several slides where there are resources. You can find 8 lessons for talking about race and racism and racial justice. At the link below, it's the opportunity agenda, and you'll find this particular slide for ways to talk to your communities, to lean into the space, lean into your discomfort or dis-ease, and figure out a way to listen and learn. and be a positive contributor. The resources across the top are of the most recent bestseller lists, whether it's Barnes and Noble's recommendations, Women's Health Magazine's recommendations, or the Harlem Schomburg Center's list of best books to buy for enhancing your knowledge around racism and ways to interrupt it. Social transformation is huge, and it is upon us. It is a movement. We're focused on overcoming racism, something that is systemic and pervasive throughout the world. Overcoming racism will require a love greater than the fear that separates us. I leave that with you, and I thank you for your time and attention. And I'm going to turn it back over to Anita, and we will take on your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbs, for that very sobering and honest look at the past and where we are today. We thank you for that. Your resources, the book, that slide is really, it has a lot of good information. And I do hope that those of us watching today will go out and, check out these books. And with that, we will begin to take questions. Let's see which one's going to be the first one coming in. Let's see, I'm looking for, not sure if I see some things on our Facebook page. And I don't know if Kelly, go ahead, Kelly.
I do have a question here. Would you like?
Okay. Go ahead.
The question states, I have a question for Dr. Gibbs. A few years ago, I learned the term microaggression. And it's defined as a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. Dr. Gibbs, please give several examples of subtle microaggressions and tell us how we can intervene to bring awareness to the speaker.
All right. Great question, Kelly. Thank you so much. I will provide two examples of my own experience when I am often in the public's eye. Invariably, people will approach me and just reflect on how articulate I am. And I can't recall any time that I've approached a white person and told them that they are so articulate. Nor have I heard it or reviewed it in my readings of other people that they have been referred to as articulate, because it's something that for white people, it's a given. But for Black folk, it's a surprise and perhaps something that really stands out. And while it may be perceived as a compliment, it is belittling the people who stand behind me. It is underestimating the people whose shoulders I stand upon, who have supported me, who have elevated me. And all I'm doing is speaking in a language that my privilege has provided me to be exposed to. And I understand that my plight is about opening the door for others. And I don't take kindly to that statement. And so as individuals, in moving into that space where your inclination is to, one, think that this is what you're hearing, someone very articulate. Think about, why is it that you have that filter going to where that's what you're hearing based upon what you're looking at, versus that filter is not on when you're looking at someone who is of your same race. And then another example is in the classroom in graduate school. One of my professors started his lecture off by saying, when we all came over to America, we had a great opportunity to begin a new life. And that was so insulting and hurtful. I raised my hand, interrupted the lecture, of course, to acknowledge not all of us came to America that way. He was dumbfounded and didn't really know where my comments were coming from. And therefore, it was important for me to embellish, which for my classmates was a distraction that they would have otherwise preferred to not have to suffer through. And it's not an ally mentality that I was looking for. It just wasn't, because it's very difficult for me to embrace that word ally as if there is some degree of authenticity and depth that one has truly traveled to take that position, that somehow the years of oppression and the struggle can somehow be understood and presumed that it can be erased by having an ally who understands, who really is seeking to be my voice. I can't refute where times are these days in the press for people to find a word that gives them comfort and a focus on where to go in the land as an ally. But that's a very tenuous disposition, because that ally has to sort of have some element of separation when I can go back home to a space. I can go back home to a space that's very different from their space. Their space is enhanced privilege. The level of life lived, their interactions with their day-to-day beyond that moment is not the same as an ally. They resort right back to the same path of privilege that I don't have. And so I cautiously encourage the word ally, because it can be a level of insult and disruption as well.
I totally agree with you, Dr. Gibbs. I know for me, I've heard those same things. Where did you learn to speak and sound like you do? And it is an insult. It's an assumption, first of all, they're making about me. And this is how my parents spoke in my house. This was what I heard. And, people will say good English. Well, to my knowledge, there's just that one. And you're right. They think it's a compliment in there, but there really isn't. It's not a compliment. And as I've often said, and you alluded to it, the stress that a person of color has as they, navigate the world we live in. There are issues and assumptions made about us that, they never, encounter. And we're here in Oregon, in which people of color are, fewer in number. So there's always that, if you're raised here like I was, you're never able to just engage with your race or an entire race of people of color. So I've had to learn, as I'm sure you have had too, to navigate both worlds.
Yeah.
And, sometimes, there's issues in navigating both worlds. There's statements made about, how well you did that, or are you this? And, I'm just me, Anita, Anita would love.
Dr. Gibbs, there's a follow-up question to the microaggressions question and your response to the articulate comment. Someone asked, well, what can we say when someone says you are articulate in our presence? And I mean someone that is white or white passing. How can we be your ally in that moment?
Let me understand the question. Can you repeat it?
So she's asking, what can we say when someone says to you, you are articulate in our presence, meaning a white or white passing person's presence?
So my belief is that if you see something, say something. But it does matter when you say it.
Mm-hmm.
And I much prefer the conversation to be a sidebar and not be something that is inserted in my interaction, because that's my space. And it's up to me to navigate, and to assume that I need someone to speak up as an advocate or ally that's a huge assumption. It's a huge assumption.
Mm-hmm.
To assume that it would be offensive to one person and not to the other. That's a huge generalization, and we're not monolithic. And so if the inclination to want to be an ally is to be an ally to your white peer or to that individual who made that statement, and to go off into a separate conversation to say, you know, I overheard that comment, and I'd like to just ask you to think about what you may have said to Dr. Gibbs and what he may have heard and been left with having to interpret based upon your statement. And I'd like you to really explore the motivations of your statement and how we can help each other to think more critically about what it is that we really want to say versus the level of disrespect and microaggression that we would otherwise be conveying.
I have another question for you here.
Sure.
Often a white person's expression of anger is seen as righteous, but a Black person's expression of anger is seen as aggressive and or dangerous. How can those of us who are white or white passing become more aware of tone police and work to explore patterns to prevent it?
Yeah, I think the easiest path is the one that's more challenging. It is simply, how did I get here, to the extent to which this is my belief, this is my anxiety, this is something I want to change because I perceived this in a very wrong way. All of those statements started with I, and the work starts with self. The kind of work that says, I have unconscious bias. And through the lens that I have viewed the world, I've come to trust my biases because they protected me. In certain instances, that's true and absolutely spot on, necessary. But in other ways, those biases run so rampant in our brains that we don't take time to unpack the ways in which those lessons came to us, those reactions came to us, the automatic, routinized thought process that always lands us back there when we hear passion and we mistake it for anger. And therefore, one, addressing that bias is a journey unto itself. And the level of discipline that's necessary is all about who's taking the journey and what resources are they acquiring to sustain them on that journey. I think it takes a little bit more than curiosity. It's really changing one's lifestyle and being very motivated to create the lifestyle that structures and reinforces what one needs to stay on path with disrupting the unconscious biases that pervade, to the extent to which we develop very conscious decisions and reactions to go away from that which we're comfortable with, to lean into the spaces where we're uncomfortable because we've assumed that's not a safe space, and we stick with it despite how difficult it might be, if it's meaningful. Because oftentimes you hear, I try, but those people wouldn't give me the time of day. They shut me down. Those people really were very angry. Without the understanding of how we're doing more harm when we say those people. And then we generalize the experience to everyone, and we become the victim because of our efforts in the midst of people who've been victimized and have right to be reticent, distrusting, angry, and speaking about, hey, it's not my responsibility to educate you or take care of you in the midst of your education. I have 400 years of overdoing or overcoming, and you're just beginning your journey today. That's an unfair, untenable request to put on people who have been oppressed, to somehow ask for people to take their knee off your neck and give you the space to breathe, and for them to be comfortable and safe at the same time. That's just not, that's, I don't know what else to say.
And hearing your response again, it's not our responsibility. And Kelly and I've had, numerous conversations, in the last few weeks. And as I've told her, at 67, I'm tired of being the classroom. I'm tired of, the questions. I'm not your teachable moment anymore. And I challenge white people to challenge other white people, because you haven't listened to me and us for over 400 years. What makes me think, or you think that, oh, an hour with you and I've got it? We have lived our life always, on edge, just making sure we're moving in the right direction, or, we even are concerned about being perceived, and we will diminish ourselves, as parents, we teach our children how to behave when they go out there. You've all heard about the talk.
Yeah.
And mine are 37, 42, and 43, and they've heard the talk. And as I've shared with Kelly, I have an impressive professional career. All my children do, but that has not stopped me from being pulled over 3 times here in Portland, Oregon, for just minor things. And then being asked, well, what's that in your car? I say a lot of police officers operate under the hope. I hope I pulled this person of color over, and I hope they have something that they shouldn't in their car. The son who's a cardiac thoracic surgeon, when he was doing his internship here at OHSU, he gets pulled over on the freeway coming from St. Louis. It doesn't matter. What they see first is the color of our skin. And then, as Dr. King has said, we want you to know us for the content of our character.
Well
and
said.
You have to be willing to, get some discomfort in your life. We've lived in discomfort for a very long time. And you wonder why we have hypertension? Well, try walking in our shoes for a day.
We have about 5 minutes left, and a question came in, and it says this: I know that a lot of parents are wondering what they can do to address the topic of racism, privilege, and social justice with their children. Do you have any recommendations, things parents can do to help their children to help break the cycle and be a part of the solution?
Depending upon how the age of the child or children, I think Sesame Street just came out with a program that aired on CNN last week, the discussion about race. And so the developmental level, I think each parent will have to determine kind of how and what manner and when to have those discussions. I think it's important to lay the foundation, not just at home, but the associations that you would have, because the diversity of the classroom where that child goes to school is really important. Be available and responsive to not just the concerns that come home through your child, but because of the parent network that you've established and making sure that a diverse parent representation is there in the school to give voice, but also you seek out the network where your kids are also connected in that space where there's a opportunity for co-learning, and having developed trust, the opportunity to have deeper, richer, and ongoing conversations so that even children interacting across race, there isn't a stifling moment when your child comes in and says something that the other child said to them about them and their difference. And so it's just always making oneself available for those moments. It's not really a structure. It's about how ready are you to have those conversations and how seriously committed are you to the depth that one needs to go to walk a journey, to inform the journey, to help transform a different space for the child who's coming into inheriting the society that you will leave for them. And that you've provided them a lot of resources, rich information, and reflections on how to see the world around them differently as you're helping to make a way for them to navigate safely into the space, that it's not just transforming around them, but because of their knowledge and passion and vision for the world that they want to inherit, they're transforming it at the same time.
That's powerful. And you're right, depending on the age of the children, it's case by case. Sometimes the moment is there, and sometimes you might want to share it later in the evening and bring it up to the child if they're old enough. When you heard such and such, what were your thoughts? We have to be mindful as parents not to give our children, too many of our beliefs, which is one of the reasons why we're in the situation we're in. So, for those who have said, that was 400 years ago, get over it. I'm here to say it's happening still this week. When you have physicians say, well, the reason why COVID is higher in people of color is because they don't wash their hands. So, hey, this is 2020. But, it's a brave new world, and we should be bold enough and be willing to enter it.
Yeah.
I wanted to say a quick note that we did get through the pre-submitted questions, but if anyone would like to continue to post their questions after this live chat has closed, we will do our best to get information and resources to help answer those questions. And but it is 4 o'clock.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And again, we thank you, Dr. Gibbs, and I trust that everybody was able to really feel your humble servant's heart, because it comes across, it's palpable, and we appreciate you and we thank you for your diligence. And so, as we've said, we're the ancestors. Let's leave a good path. And I'd like to leave with a quote from Dr. Maya Angelou, and it goes, do the best you can until you know better. And once you know better, do better. we thank you and have a safe weekend, everyone.
Keep hope alive.
Amen. Amen.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Dr. Gibbs. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.